I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
The major issue behind this really is demographic change and immigration. So, the major point for almost every far right party you can think of is some sort of issue with immigrants that are changing the demographics of the countries they're in, which basically means these are non white immigrants, right? The thing that really pushes the far right is race. And if you look at the main far right political parties across the globe, they usually combine some kind of visceral hatred of migrants, refugees, immigrants, with this fight against what they call gender ideology, which really means LGBTQ rights, women's rights to bodily autonomy.
Hi, friends. Even though it is only the start of summer, most of the country is feeling the heat right now, and in more ways than just the weather. I talked to Dr. Heidi Beirich, co-founder and chief strategy officer for the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's an expert on the American and European far right, including white supremacists, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-government, and other extremist movements. You can find out more about their work at globalextremism.org. Last week, as I wrote in the newsletter, I went to Arlington, Virginia for a family event and spent a little time in Washington, D.C. It really struck me how this lovely city was not just home to everyday people like us, but also the right-wing extremists who put together Project 2025, a roadmap to implement authoritarian policies and consolidate power if a Republican becomes president. If you haven't yet, go back and listen to Andrew Watkins and Matthew Taylor on Christian nationalism and Project 2025. And then think about the fact that most Americans, the ones who are just living their lives, perhaps deliberately avoiding politics because it feels overwhelming or icky or something that has nothing to do with them, they have no idea about Project 2025, its Christian nationalist core, and the plans to take power immediately. These disengaged regular folks also don't have any idea of what Donald Trump has done to become a convicted felon. And when most of these people learn more about what Trump has done or what MAGA Republicans are planning to do, they shift toward the Dems. But if they don't know, and they take in the local news owned by Sinclair or the mainstream media that glorifies Donald Trump and demeans Biden because it earns them more money, they don't understand the stakes of this election. During this conversation, I asked Heidi Beirich about Russian or Iranian-backed disinformation. She replied that most of the disinformation we have here is homegrown. I'd like to push back a little about this. Many Republicans use talking points straight from the Kremlin or Iran. One of the key people I follow on Twitter and Patreon is Angry Staffer, who is an anonymous member of the intelligence community who has been providing accurate information starting during the Trump presidency. His information has proved accurate and insightful, and I want to share something he wrote this week. He said, "I think people are still misunderstanding the concept of influence campaigns, particularly when it comes to Russia. Let's look at an example from 10 years ago that I think didn't get near enough attention. In September of 2014, Russian trolls from the Internet Research Agency, IRA, started a Facebook group called The Heart of Texas. This group promulgated all kinds of bullshit, including secessionist/Texit, Dems are coming for your guns, etc. They also created the United Muslims of America. This group also promoted crazy rhetoric, including Sharia law in America, which has always been a weird political hot-button issue for the right, even though it's literally not a thing. In 2016, after growing in popularity, partially due to a massive Russian botnet, these groups orchestrated competing rallies and counter-rallies across the street from one another in Houston. They were trying to stoke the flames of cultural violence, and it almost worked. These groups accumulated millions of likes, hundreds and thousands of comments, and influenced thousands of people from a building in Moscow. None of this was organic, and it almost completely devolved into violence anyway. This is only one example. This same story has played out over multiple states and multiple flashpoints. These efforts have accelerated since 2016, and Russia, And to be fair, China and Iran, etc., has only gotten better at obfuscation. If you see something online that feels like it's meant to piss you off, that's probably because it's meant to piss you off. While they may have a political preference, the overarching goal of most foreign intelligence agencies is to sow division in the United States. If Russia can make us doubt the process, question the facts, or lose faith in our systems, it doesn't matter who wins because they've stacked the deck so they, Russia, won't lose. With that said, here's my conversation with Dr. Heidi Beirich. Please take time to write a review of this podcast, and if you can, send in a one-time donation to the pod via PayPal at www.freedomoverfascism.us. Heidi Beirich, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Your visit here is so timely because one of the things that we do here is that we talk about what's going on not only in the United States, but around the world regarding the far right. So we've got a whole bunch of Christian nationalist groups here. You have the people writing Project 2025 and wanting to implement it. Can you tell us why the far right seems to be having a resurgence here and across the globe?
The major issue behind this really is demographic change and immigration. So the major point for almost every far right party you can think of is some sort of issue with immigrants that are changing the demographics of the countries they're in, which basically means these are non-white immigrants, right? Whether they're coming from the Middle East, which is more common in Europe, or from Latin America here or other parts of the world, and they are somehow viewed as, and I'm going to use quotes, replacing the native population. So demographic change, I would say, is the number one driver. There are, of course, other things: economic discontent, the collapse of socialist and left-wing political parties in a lot of parts of the world, the neoliberal agenda, which people have seen as not helping them economically. But the thing that really pushes the far right is race, something about othering of race. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with this is there's also on the far right, because of the rise of Christian nationalism, this anti LGBTQ, anti women's rights agenda. And if you look at the main far right political parties across the globe, they usually combine some kind of visceral hatred of migrants, refugees, immigrants, with this fight against what they call gender ideology, which really means LGBTQ rights, women's rights to bodily autonomy. Those are the main pillars of these political parties.
We're going to be seeing a lot more migration over the coming decades, centuries, with climate displacement and wars. Where does this idea of replacement originate? Who used it first, and why does it seem so salient now?
It is a flat out white supremacist idea, and it has come under different names. Back in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion of white genocide. That was predominantly among American white supremacists. Then moving into the 2000s, it began to morph into the replacement idea after there was a book published in 2011 by a Frenchman, Renaud Camus, called The Grand Remplacement. I'm sure I've garbled the French terribly, but that's the great replacement. So this idea of white genocide just morphed into the great replacement. It was the same concept. The number of white people is going down worldwide, the number of black and brown people is increasing, and there is a transfer of migrants from these areas into traditionally white countries. And this is truly the most important talking point among white supremacists. But not only white supremacists. It would be one thing if this was confined to some kind of hyper racist fringe or neo Nazi fringe. It's not. In the last decade, we have seen this idea go from white supremacy to far right politics and sometimes just right wing politics. And people who don't have pale skin, who come into those environments, are not actually part of the community. This is what the Nazis did, right, with the Jews. Jews were not, they couldn't be considered part of the German community. The Nazis racialized this as Aryanism, right, an Aryan race. It's similar, though not exactly the same. But at the core of it, it's this idea that certain places should be white and that white people have a particular skin color. But more than that, they have a particular culture. So the narrative is they're less likely to engage in crime, they're less sexualized, they're less diseased. And these are exactly the same themes that the Nazis used against Jews. So it's the same propaganda coming back. And the idea that they cannot assimilate. In other words, there is something genetic to white people that makes them democratic, less likely to engage in crime, smarter when we get to IQ and race kind of things. And that if these other people come in, they're going to pollute the society and destroy it. That's the basic idea here, that they are unassimilable, and that we're not all part of one human race. And you ask me, why are these messages being used? These are the oldest tropes in the world to build political bases. It's very simple to just demonize a group of people as being the reasons for everything that is going wrong in your particular country.
So, probably additionally to skin color is religion, right? Because if you're white but not Christian, you're not really white.
That's true. And if you're white and too far left wing, you're not really part of this conception of white. All of this white supremacist stuff has come to be fused with Christian nationalist tendencies. The Christian nationalist movement, although there are some people of color in it, is predominantly a white movement. It's also predominantly led by white males, so it's very paternalistic. And it has at its core this sort of vision of a family, right? Mom, dad, couple of kids, they're white, and they are the true inheritors of the countries that they live in. And of course, Christian nationalism, unlike white supremacy, has this view of religion leading politics that is a bit different, right, than you see with traditional white supremacy and a biblically based society. So this is another problem, right? The far right is complex. There are strains that are just flat out racist and white supremacist or neo Nazi. And then there are strains that are religiously driven, like Christian nationalism. And frankly, the Christian nationalists are the ones with the most power. They are the ones that
Mhm.
control governments. They are the Speaker of the House in the United States. Mike Johnson represents this. They are the ones with billions of dollars. I'm thinking of Leonard Leo, who's a key figure in these movements, who got just one donation of $1.6 billion dollars from someone. So their agenda is the one that is most likely to reign supreme because they have the resources, they have the connections, and they have political power in a way that these others don't.
And this was the motivating idea of the Nazis, right? That Jews were not white and they were replacing Aryans, and that led to industrialized genocide. So, why is that same idea coming back? I mean, you talk about migration, but you just mentioned synagogue shootings, you mentioned mosque shootings. Who's considered white in these ideologies?
It's always a great question because there really is no answer to what exactly being white is.
As we've been discussing, Christian nationalism is one of the most central parts of these ideologies. Can you talk a little bit about how that relates to all of these racial and racialized ideas of white superiority?
Yeah, so
White
Christian nationalism, although it has some adherents who are people of color, basically at its heart has a white vision of America. It features a white family, mom, dad, kid, and it believes in a supremacy of a particular kind of Christianity, which is a very right-wing Christian view that is powerful because it has connections to wealthy supporters. Leonard Leo, who's one of the prime Christian nationalists, got just one donation, $1.6 billion. Other organizations that are pushing this agenda, like the Heritage Foundation, have hundreds of millions of dollars behind them. And it has political power. So, Mike Johnson, our Speaker of the House, is clearly a Christian nationalist and has worked at advocacy organizations pushing the Christian nationalist agenda. And the way that Christian nationalists view society is that there is a religion that is privileged and should be supreme. They don't believe in separation of church and state. They have a particular view of the family, which completely excludes LGBTQ people, really anything except for this kind of idealized white family with kids. And they don't believe in women's equality, certainly not their bodily autonomy or sexual health or reproductive rights. So there are second status folks in this realm, right? Women, people who identify differently than heterosexual or cisgendered. And ultimately, it's not a vision that encompasses rights for people of color, immigrants, and others, because Christian nationalists also believe in very harsh immigration policies. If you look at Project 2025, which is just a bunch of Christian nationalist organizations laying out what they view as the next conservative president's agenda should be, they're talking about putting immigrants back in camps, separating children from families. And this, of course, is a racialized discourse, right? Because immigrants are coming from Latin America. They're also adamantly against anything that's attempting to provide equity and equality for people of color, given the American history that we have, right? That would all be stripped out of government policies. They're obviously rabidly against affirmative action. And lately, one of their main acolytes, Stephen Miller, right, who was the person who designed those horrible immigration policies under Trump, has been running around and suing people for what he claims is anti white racism that's going on in this country. So there is no question that Christian nationalism rests on a racial base and that that base privileges white people. And what's important about the Christian nationalist movement is that it's far more powerful than white supremacists. Yes, it's got strains of white supremacy, but this is something that's in the political mainstream. This isn't something out there on the fringes. And unfortunately, Americans seem to know a whole lot more about the fringe groups than they do about this movement, which directly poses a threat to our civil and human rights and to our democracy. Because these are not people who are fans of democracy. They're fans of governments like you find in Hungary, where you have very strong executive officers and you do things to restrict the voters' rights generally, the ability to campaign, all kinds of things like that. So, this is an authoritarian project that's got a lot of money behind it and is deeply embedded within our government already.
So, given its power, and as you said, Mike Johnson ascribes to it, and as we learned in our conversation with Matt Taylor, the flag with the green tree that says appeal to heaven is a Christian nationalist flag calling for violence against the government. And so we've seen that in Sam Alito's yard. We see it outside the office of Mike Johnson. And it's kind of code for we don't believe in this American democracy. Although code doesn't seem to be a big factor because they'll say it all out loud. Is there a way to defeat this political movement, or are we kind of in this for the long haul?
I think we are in this for the long haul. Project 2025 has that year in its title, but regardless of what the outcome is of the election, it's not something that's going to stop. I would also argue it's not something that we just wait in anticipation for the year 2025. This agenda is already being put in place, and particularly in red states like Texas, Alabama, Florida, Oklahoma, where the kinds of things they're calling for are there. Now, I will say that we found over the last few elections, and we're finding now when it comes to referendums on abortion, that when people are aware of how extreme this agenda is, they tend to reject it, at least in purple states and blue states. So there is some hope, right, that voters will see this as out of control extremism, a threat to our democracy, and not want to support it. There's a particular group, it's part of Project 2025, Moms for Liberty. They're these book banning, anti LGBTQ folks. A lot of their people who they ran for school boards in the last round of elections lost once people realized what the agenda is. But this is also something, Christian nationalism, that is supported by millions of people and is backed by a lot of money. So it's not going to go disappear because of a couple elections that reject their ideas. They'll be back, they'll be back, they'll be back. And they've been around a long time. The plan to dismantle Roe and abortion rights was a 30-year plan that people worked on. So these people think long term and they're well funded. So they don't go away right away.
It seems like that kind of event horizon is something that our pro democracy side can't think in that large of a gap in time. I mean, some of the red states that flipped took more than 10 years building power, and the right has taken more than 30 years to dismantle Roe. And I think that our side not only wants quick results, but doesn't know how to stay the course for long enough to see it as the same course and the same fight over decades. And so that's a disadvantage for democracy. Do you see any backlash against this globally? We see pockets of it here, those referenda that you talked about.
First of all, I couldn't agree with you more about the democracy movement. I don't think we have a vision that is easy to grasp as much as these folks do. We don't have symbols that people can immediately recognize us, and we haven't been in it for a long fight, and we've been on the back foot in understanding how problematic these far right movements are. And I say that to my fellow progressives, but I also say it to philanthropy, that you have got to back efforts to protect democracy over the long run, and you have to expose these things and educate people, and you can't walk away
Mhm.
from it after one election cycle, right? This is just it's been a mistake for a long time.
What do you see globally?
There have been some successes at pushing back against these movements. I'll use Poland first, where we had a Christian nationalist government that was very close to some powerful actors in that world here in the United States, like the legal powerhouse Alliance Defending Freedom, which is the one behind the overturning of Roe, but the Masterpiece Cake thing, the Mephipristone case, which we still don't know the outcome of. In Poland, the PIS government politicized the judiciary. It had a Christian nationalist vision that was more rooted in Catholicism than Protestantism here in the US, but it was the same anti LGBTQ, anti women's rights, anti migrant thing. They even had LGBTQ free zones. People from that community were being beaten in the streets. It was a very ugly period of history, and civil society came together and threw them out in the last round of elections and elected a moderate who's now trying to undo those authoritarian moves to weaponize the entire government, which of course is what the Project 2025 people want to do here with the civil service, with the Department of Justice, and so on, to politicize everything from the top to the bottom. So Poland is an example of people power. Sadly, in
Mhm.
Hungary, where the same kind of thing was attempted in the last elections, it was a massive failure. Viktor Orban has been much more clever in rigging elections through non voting means, right? You can't campaign, you can't leaflet, you can't get on television, these sorts of things. But I think Poland has something for us to learn from. Brazil, I think the election of Lula in the last round, even though it was very narrow, was a big success against the forces of Christian nationalism, racism, and in that case, anti indigenous and anti woman beliefs. Although the Bolsonaro movement is still there and still has power, it's a little bit like the MAGA movement here in the United States right now. So they have a long term problem. There are other countries like Greece where there had been powerful neo Nazis actually in the government, a political party called Golden Dawn, and they completely decimated them both with judicial means and civic activism. So we have some lessons to learn from other countries when it comes to this. But I will say that this is not an easy road to go down. Once the far right gets into power, as they are, whether all by themselves or in coalition in places as diverse as Sweden, as Italy, they tend to not go away, and they tend to shift center right parties further to the right. So they become more punishing about immigration and civil rights and so on. And what we end up with is a dynamic where countries have a center right party and a far right party and not much left on the left. And that's kind of the political formation that we're seeing arise in many places. In fact, countries that had no far right 2 years ago, Ireland and Portugal, now have far right parties or individuals who are gaining power. So this seems to be the dynamic in politics that we see going forward.
So, coming back here to the United States and needing to look at much longer term, slow gains rather than fixing it all in one election. What do you see the pro democracy side needing to do to continue the fight? And how do we combat the exhaustion that activists feel because they feel like they've been fighting for so long and not making progress?
I think the exhaustion is a real thing. Sadly, we can't give up, right? We have a vision of society that
Mhm.
I think is far superior. Obviously, democracy is better than authoritarianism, and having your rights and your freedoms protected is better than not. I think that one of the problems we've had on the progressive side is too much focus on just the federal government and, in particular, the presidency as key to protecting these kinds of freedoms. People, not on the right, but on the left, seem to have forgotten how much power state governments actually have. And if you want to protect democracy, it's got to go the whole length from the local to the county to the state, all the way up to national offices. And you have to be in that fight in all those ways, and you have to keep at that fight. There's also the issue of justices, right, who run for office. For too long, we just kind of let people slip by, and they get elected into
Mhm.
these posts on off year presidential elections, and they've got like 10% of the vote. And so we need to have far more participation generally. Half of Americans don't even vote in presidential elections, right? We have to find some way for people to understand what's at stake and why this is a good thing. And that's where I go back to the idea that we need a bit of a vision that people can quickly grasp that will motivate them. A
Mhm.
MAGA hat tells something to people on the far right. It tells them what they're about, what their plans are for the country, and so on. We don't have something simple like that, which is ridiculous,
Mhm.
right? Because our vision is actually a better one. Do you want to have freedom,
Mhm.
right? Do you want to have rights? Do you want to decide your future in a democracy? This is actually a really positive vision. And I think we need some work on narrative on our side on this as well. And we've got to find a way to get people more involved at the local level because that's how you build up, right? The right was always smart. Start with the school board races and the local elections. And that leads to someone becoming politically savvy, right, about how to run for office. And then they move up to the state house and so on. And they gain skills and knowledge about how to do these things. We need to think about that as well.
I've talked to a lot of people who are deeply involved in thinking about that, recruiting candidates, training them, and looking at how having candidates contesting every single race actually creates more votes that then trickle up. It's like reverse coattails. If they're voting for a state house candidate in a rural area where they've never been asked for their vote in the past, that's more votes for the top of the ticket. And so there are a lot of organizations doing that. One of the things that we end up talking about a lot here is the fact that the media is not terribly pro democracy. So, creating our own pro democracy media is something that a lot of our guests have talked about, is that we might have a good narrative. We do. We're on the right side. People agree with us. But not only are we not telling the story in a cogent way, but we haven't found ways to actually reach people. And my constant call on here is go talk to the people outside your bubble in your real life who trust you because they're getting a completely different picture politically than we are. They're in a different reality. Let's go back to talking about Project 2025. What are the greatest dangers of Project 2025?
I think they sit in three buckets, basically. The complete politicization of federal agencies, everything that falls under presidential control, in particular the DOJ and the FBI, and the idea that they might be used against the enemies of whoever becomes president. The fact that the Department of Justice is treated with a certain amount of independence, and so is the head of the FBI in particular, those are norms, those aren't laws. And they can easily be overridden. And then it comes back to the civil service being completely, a bunch of people fired and political partisans put in place. That's the first bucket. The second bucket, I would say, is all the threats to civil rights that exist in this world. So, in particular, they want to strip rights from the LGBTQ community, When it comes to women's rights, it's not just about abortion, it's about contraception, which they're seeking to ban in certain states where these people are in control. It's about IVF. It's probably going to be about no fault divorce, which is another thing that Project 2025 supporters want to strip. So, kind of the whole panoply of women's rights is under attack. And for the LGBTQ community, it's a similar thing. Even Justice Alito has talked about getting rid of same sex marriage. So, we could see massive rollbacks. But it's not just women and LGBTQ people, because the entire government apparatus would no longer be concerned with Black folks. Immigrants would be punished. So it's everybody but white men would see rollbacks on their rights or some kind of terribly harsh treatment. That's bucket number two. And then the third, of course, is Christian nationalism, the vision that they want to put in place, getting rid of the separation of church and state, privileging right wing, largely evangelical Christianity as the law of the land. Mike Johnson talks about how you want to know about him, look at the Bible. There is no constitution for these people, right? They don't care about the
Hmm.
constitution. They have a narrow biblical view of society. And that's the third thing that I think is extremely concerning. And just as a practical matter, what would that mean? Right now in Tennessee, a Jewish couple was denied the ability to adopt a child from a Christian adoption agency. A Project 2025 advisor was representing that adoption agency. They just changed the rules so that people who are anti LGBTQ can take in foster kids who are LGBTQ. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about on a practical level, besides losing contraception, same sex marriage, and God knows whatever else.
So this is something that we talk a lot about state and local politics and how we need to start in our own backyards. And that's where the most good you can do is where you are, where you live. But defeating Republicans at the national level is necessary, but not sufficient to keeping going a little bit longer, keeping this Republican experiment, small r. It's going to be election after election where we must win. Whereas the forces on the side of Christian nationalism and white nationalism have already grasped power in a large number of states. And I think you're right. You said we were on our back foot. And I think that we're still playing defense. What would you say playing offense looks like?
I think playing offense looks like, first of all, a lot more money injected into all of these efforts. Serious money. I mean, it just boggles the mind that Leonard Leo could get one person to give him $1.6 billion. Just think about how much money that is. There's three Texas billionaires who are behind a lot of the politics in Texas that is pushing Christian nationalism. That's one thing. And the pro democracy movement has to think about resources and what that means. The other thing is that I think civic activity at the local and state level needs to be pumped up. It's amazing to me how much the Republicans have built apparatuses from the local all the way up to the federal to push their messaging. And we're probably a little bit less likely to all come on the same page, like you sometimes find on the far right. But certainly everybody on the left believes in freedom, democracy, and civil and human rights. We need to get that message out there. We also need, I think for some people it sounds hyperbolic, right, to talk about the fact that our democracy is under threat and all these things. And those of us who are studying it know it's no joke. There's a lot of think tanks and others who say, look, we're hanging by a thread in many ways. But for the average American, they probably don't think that. So we have to figure out ways to message and speak to them. You already brought up the problems with media that makes them understand that this is actually real. Now, I think Roe, the overturning of Roe, was a shock to the system. The realization that something that had been a right for decades could be taken away and that somebody's daughter is going to have fewer rights than their mother has. But even the rest of the agenda, most Americans don't understand. So there's a lot of work to raise awareness, explain these things. We should be as aggressive, frankly, as the far right is about using advertising and marketing in social media, targeting at youth. I mean, they have been at it hard for a long time, and we're not as aggressive on that front. And I think also it would be nice if a lot of civil society organizations that are involved in all kinds of issues were to take up this. So whether it's housing or climate, understand and tell your people and tell your supporters this is a real threat, not just to, let's say, environmentalism, but also to democracy itself. And there's a lot of lack of coordination, I think, on the left among different kinds of movements, whether it's unions or climate action, et cetera, on these issues. And that it could be helpful if we would all at least take up the democracy banner and warn of the dangers of things like Project 2025 with one voice.
Yeah, I think sometimes, people just living their lives maybe tune into an election only at the presidential level and only in the fall, and finding ways to engage people who are unengaged, who think government does not work or does not work for them is really important. The other thing is, I think that as Americans, because our scope of history is so short, the idea that history keeps going, that we're not at the end of history, right? That we're not like stuff isn't going to end after us, right? There have been hundreds of thousands of years where things go back and forth and countries are at war and not at war and different forms of government exist and are toppled. And I think learning how to view ourselves as part of the stream of history as opposed to the end of it would be helpful.
I actually think that's an interesting idea because there's a naive belief on the part of Americans that the arc of history is going to bend towards justice. And I'm not trying to criticize Martin Luther King. That arc needs to be bent by someone, right? It has to be pushed. And we have this
Mhm.
naive idea of progress. And even when things are in a backlash situation or going backwards, it's like you got rose colored glasses on, you don't see it. And most Americans don't understand that the history of this country has been one of progress and then horrible backlash, whether against Black folks after the Civil War, whether against immigration in the 1920s, right? They haven't seen history in that way. And so it makes you sort of blind to the possibility that this could all disappear tomorrow.
Exactly. And I think people across the world who have been in countries or regions that do have a long and less interrupted history can look back 1,000 years and see themselves in the whole line of what's going on, whereas our country started only a couple hundred years ago. So everything we do is somehow separate and sui generis, as opposed to being part of world events and world history that will happen and then will become part of the past. So that leads me to, I think, my final question, which is how much does foreign disinformation, Russian, Chinese, Iranian disinformation drive the conversation here?
I would say it's a factor. There's a ton of it out there. Russian disinformation in the 2016 election cycle and right after was so powerful that it was able to mobilize protests at mosques. In other words, bots got people to go out and protest Muslims. So there's no question that is a factor. And they are going to flood the zone for Trump largely. But I will say that we have enough of our own disinformation going on in the United States that I think, for the most part, is more likely to sway people. So, what I mean by this is election denial coming from American officials, which is blatant lies. The number of lawsuits now against people pushing that is kind of immense, but it's Americans pushing it, so it's going to be more believed than some weird thing coming out of Iran. There's the election denialism. There are efforts to sway people in Latino communities and lie about the agenda of the left. There are lies about immigrants and immigration that are being pushed. If you get into medical disinformation, that's a whole other nightmare. As much as I do want to stop outside interference in American elections, the zone is being flooded by our own people. That's what Steve Bannon advocated, right? Flood the zone with
Right.
a bunch of stuff and confuse people. I'm not trying to make light of that propaganda, but what I'm saying is that there are so many lies coming from the far right that it's astounding. And it's always more believable when it comes from an American than something is stilted language and odd about it, and you almost feel like it's propaganda coming from the outside. So we're dooming ourselves. And the social media companies are dooming us by allowing this stuff to proliferate and not enforcing their content moderation rules and whatnot. That's my basic feeling about the outside interference.
Is there anything that we talked about or didn't talk about that you think our listeners ought to know about far right ideology, activity, threat, facing that threat?
I will say that one thing we didn't talk about was the potential violence coming out of the far right.
Ugh.
Right now, we are at historic highs for threats against people in office, people serving in election positions, local officials. I mean, really, it's quite astounding how horrible this has gotten. And although people of all political stripes have been threatened, it's more likely that the threats are targeting people who identify as Democrats, secondly, as independents. And then election officials, it's been so much demonization, starting with Trump's denialism back in 2020, and it continues. And we've got election deniers on county boards that oversee elections. That's the situation in one of the counties here in Georgia where I am. So this is a problem. The white supremacist Proud Boys, the group that was so key to the January 6th insurrection, has been revving up and showing up at primaries, at Super Tuesday states. The conviction of Trump last week has set off the far right like we haven't seen in years, meaning talk of civil war, get your guns, anti Semitic stuff, racist stuff, and attacks on the judicial system, the jurors, the judge. This stuff is really at high levels, and we're moving into the heightened season of the election. These are always times when you tend to see upticks in violence, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so we're very concerned about what this is going to look like over the next few months. And I don't want to scaremonger with people, but in 2018, there were 4 terrorist attacks, including the Tree of Life one, right around the elections. And last time around, we had riots in Washington, D.C., led by white supremacists in the December prior to the January 6th insurrections. We shouldn't forget that this is another thing that the far right brings with it that has no equivalent on the left, this kind of violence and threatening environment. That's another thing that I wish more Americans understood. There's a lot of both sidesism about this, and there shouldn't be. Most domestic terrorism has come from the far right. That's not me saying that, that's like the FBI saying that. And if people understood that the violence and the menacing is coming from one area, maybe they'd be more likely to not accept that.
And most of the guns are on the right. We have an entire system flooded with more guns than people, but the people who have them are on the right, thinking that a civil war is imminent
That's right.
and maybe welcoming that.
That's a rather dangerous mix.
That was a very dark way to end, although some of these do end that way. I want to thank you for your time and giving us something to really think about and have in the front of our minds as we do our activism in the coming months. Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you can, please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.